Good afternoon. As we wait for people to connect, I want to thank you for joining us today. As you know, we were initially going to focus this afternoon largely talking about Syria and what's going on there. But with the breaking news out of Israel on the hostage deal and ceasefire, I think we'll spend a lot of time talking about that. I'm Rachel Rosen. I'm the Chief Communications Officer here at DMFI on behalf of our board and our board co-chairs, Ann Lewis and Todd Richmond. On behalf of our staff and our president, Mark Melman, welcome. We're so happy to have you with us today. If you like what you're hearing today, please consider following us online. We're on social media platforms. We're on X, Facebook, Instagram. Now we're on Blue Sky. You can sign up for our news and updates over at dmfi.org. And if you want to ask a question today, if you're watching us on Zoom, you can type it into the Q&A feature there. Or if you're on a streaming network, you should be able to just type in a question into the comment section. And now I'm very pleased to turn it over to our board co-chair, our board member, Michael Rosenzweig, and he will introduce our distinguished guests. Thank you. Michael?
Thanks so much, Rachel. I appreciate it. As Rachel said, the call originally was going to focus on the situation in Syria, but of course, as always in the Middle East, we face a complicated, multifaceted, and rapidly changing environment. And today, of course, we're going to talk about the most recent events involving the ceasefire announcement and the situation with the hostages. Our first speaker is one of the most highly regarded journalists in Israel. Amos Harel has covered Israeli security affairs for the last 27 years, and he is regarded as one of Israel's leading media experts on military and defense issues. At the moment, he's senior military correspondent and defense analyst for Haaretz, Israel's longest-running newspaper. And in that role, he has written extensively about Israel's security challenges. Amos has authored 3 books. The first 2, co-written with Avi Sakharov, include The Seventh War, How We Won and Why We Lost the War with the Palestinians, which examines the Second Intifada, as well as he's written 34 Days, Israel, Hezbollah, and the War in Lebanon, which analyzes the 2006 Lebanon War. Both of those books were bestsellers in Israel, and they won the prestigious Chechik Awards for Outstanding Security Research in 2005 and 2009, respectively. Amos's most recent book is The New Face of the IDF, which was written in 2013, and it explores the evolution and transformation of Israel's military. In 2015, Amos was awarded the Sokolov Prize, Israel's most prestigious award for excellence in journalism, in recognition of his outstanding reporting and analysis. We're very, very privileged and fortunate to have Amos with us today to discuss the current situation in Israel and in the Middle East more generally. So Amos, over to you.
Hi, Michael, and thank you everybody for inviting me. What I'll try to do in the next 7 or 8 minutes is to update you on current events, and as you've noted, things are happening quite quickly. So after a very long wait of a year and more than 3 months, finally we have a hostage deal. It was announced in Qatar yesterday. There were last-minute problems during this whole day. But as we approach the evening hours here in Tel Aviv, it's assumed that the path forward would be relatively smooth. A decision was made. The Israeli cabinet would convene tomorrow morning in Jerusalem, and it would approve the deal. Hamas, of course, has also agreed to the deal. There were last-minute problems that had to do with all kinds of demands from Hamas for release of certain hostages. Prime Minister Netanyahu painted a picture of sticking to his guns and refusing some of Hamas demands. There were also domestic issues in the Netanyahu coalition, with both ministers from the far right, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, opposing the deal. Ben-Gvir will have a press conference in a few minutes. We'll see where he is heading. I'm not sure if he will resign immediately. This is quite interesting because both of these extremists are, on the one hand, very much opposed to the deal, but on the other, yet hesitating whether to actually resign from the government. Now, regarding the deal itself, the timeline is quite simple. On Sunday, a first group of female hostages would be released. It's probably 3 women, all of them civilians. Later on, female soldiers, American citizens as well. There are at least 2 American men, Israeli American, who are supposed to be released. The agreement says that 33 Israelis, all of them civilians, would be released in the first phase during the first 42 days. I would assume that about 23 to 25 of these hostages are alive. The others are bodies to be returned. And then comes phase 2, which is much more difficult to implement. There's no agreement yet about the nuts and bolts of that part. It will still leave us with a group of 65 hostages, less than half of them alive, and we'll have to see if this is actually implemented in full. And of course, there are deep, massive concessions from the Israeli side. Israel is gradually, contrary to what the Prime Minister's office is saying, Israel is gradually given up on the Philadelphia corridor in the Rafah area on the Egyptian border. And if you may recall, a few months back, it was presented by the Prime Minister as something that would never happen. Israel is also pulling out of the Netzarim corridor, which cuts the Gaza Strip to half. And there will be evacuations of other territories in the Strip, gradually pulling out most of the military forces there. So there are massive concessions, and of course, we're now being told that about 1,700 Palestinian prisoners will be released in return for our hostages. At least 200 of these are terrorists who are serving life sentences in Israel for murdering Israelis. So these are quite massive concessions from our side. If we look back at the war, there have been conflicting goals since the beginning. The Netanyahu government promised a full victory, a decisive victory over Hamas, and also it promised to destroy Hamas regime completely. On the other hand, the other goal was to release all hostages. Now, these 2 goals are actually conflicting. They do not fit together because of the timeline. It would take years to destroy Hamas, while on the other hand, we don't have those years in order to keep our hostages alive. It was clear already that lives were lost, either murdered by the Hamas captors or mistakenly killed by Israeli bombings, and that people would not survive more years in Hamas captivity. And in the end, Netanyahu decided to act and to move forward with the deal. My guess would be that the main reason for that is what I call the Trump effect. The president-elect has pulled a lot of weight here in order to force both sides and also the mediators, Qatar and Egypt, to reach this final deal. Now, the next few weeks, if not months, are going to be nerve-wracking. We know, as you remember, more than 100 hostages were released on November 23. But this is a very different situation. People have been kept mostly in tunnels without seeing daylight for more than 15 months. We know that there was torture going on, rapes, and so on. So people would be out, ill, sick, facing all kinds of psychological issues. This is going to be very, very difficult for the Israeli society, and of course for the families and the hostages themselves. And it's going to be a form, I'm not sure if this is still a politically correct term, but it's going to be a form of what you used to call in Israel Chinese torture. It will take time, and we'll wait, and there will be other micro phases to go through, and we'll have to worry about the outcome, and this will be long. One final word for the introduction. I think these events would eventually lead to a political change in Israel. Remember, it's the same Netanyahu who promised a decisive victory, who claimed that victory was around the corner a few months ago, and he didn't fulfill those promises. And yet now he has to remain in power. And the decision under Trump's pressure to go for the deal would mean quite a lot for the Israeli domestic political arena. I think there's a strong possibility that because of the discussions over the budget, over the draft law, and because of Ben Gvir and Smotrich's reservations regarding the hostage deal, There's a good possibility that the coalition would not survive very long, and that we are facing elections sometime in the near future during the first half, or maybe the first months of the second half of 2025. And Netanyahu, in order to survive, would have to somehow break towards the Israeli political center. This may mean a big Trump plan on the agenda, some kind of a deal with Saudi Arabia, possibly normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, maybe a new deal regarding Iran's nuclear project, and so on. So a lot of things are going to happen. We will hear promises or hints from Netanyahu's surroundings that Israel would actually go back to fighting within 2 months in Gaza. For the time being, I doubt whether this is going to happen. I think Trump's agenda is much stronger than that, and I'm not sure that Bibi is able to face him regarding that. So a lot is on the table. It's a very dramatic 24 hours for Israeli society, because as I know, you have been following this emotionally yourselves. This is a great issue. This whole ordeal has deeply scarred Israeli society, and we now have to begin recovering from this. And the first stage of recovery would be to have our hostages back, both the live hostages and the bodies, and starting to try and rearrange our pact with the state of Israel regarding, more than anything else, what we used to call our solidarity, the efforts that Israelis, that no person will be left behind. This is a big challenge. We're finally facing it. We'll have to see how this evolves. Okay, I think that could be enough for an introduction. Thank you.
Amos, thank you very much for those insights. We appreciate it. Just a reminder that after our second speaker speaks, there will be an opportunity for Q&A. So if you do have questions, please submit them. Our second speaker is Dr. Mara Karlin. Dr. Karlin is a leading defense and foreign policy expert who has served in national security roles for 6 U.S. Secretaries of Defense. She's currently a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and she's a professor of practice at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, where she led the Strategic Studies Department. Most recently, Dr. Karlin served in the Biden administration as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities. And in that role, she led the development and implementation of the 2022 National Defense Strategy, the Nuclear Posture Review, and the Missile Defense Review. It's the first time ever that all major reviews were conducted simultaneously, and she led that effort. Dr. Karlin previously led the Pentagon's relations with nearly 150 countries across Europe, including NATO, the Middle East, Africa, Russia, Eurasia, and the Western Hemisphere. She was a member of the 2019 Syria Study Group, which was established by Congress to make recommendations on the United States military and diplomatic strategies with respect to the conflict in Syria. And Dr. Karlin led the Strategic Studies Department at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. She wrote 2 books on military history and defense policy, and she received the Secretary of Defense Distinguished Public Service Medal, which is the highest award given to civilians by the Secretary of Defense. Dr. Karlin, we're very, very grateful to have you here. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Your expertise and experience are unparalleled, and we thank you so much for joining us. So I'll kick it over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you and to be here with Amos. So I thought what I would do is actually zoom out a little bit and talk about some of the big themes that we're seeing that I think are going to be most relevant. The first big theme is I want to talk about how war is changing and what that means for how we think about security in the Middle East. And then I want to spend a few minutes talking about the regional context as well. So zooming out, the character of war is changing, and that's become really clear in the last few years, including through the conflicts in the Middle East over the last year and a half or so. First of all, what we are seeing is that warfare really goes across a continuum now. There was a period of time where you would have kind of fighting terrorists or insurgents, a period of time where you would fight kind of big state militaries, a period of time where maybe you worried about nuclear issues. And what we are seeing with conflict today is it actually spans that continuum. So if we just look in particular at what we've seen in the wars in the Middle East over the last year and a half, it's really ranged from Iranian attempted conventional attacks to hit Israel's nuclear capability, all the way to air and ballistic missile defense, all the way to armed terrorists on motorcycles, right? You see this, of course, with the Houthis in the Red Sea and the ability of what used to be kind of a ragtag group of folks really profoundly undermining maritime security there. So we're seeing that the character of war and what it looks like is different because it moves across this continuum. We're seeing that demographically as well in terms of who's shaping the battlefield. If right now we sat here and listed all of the different entities involved in the Middle East wars today, it would take us at least a few minutes. And what you would see is regional state militaries, you would see violent non-state actors, terrorist groups, proxies, and then of course you would see extra-regional actors as well that are trying to shape what's happening. You know, countries like Russia, obviously, countries like the United States as well. And then kind of the third piece of how we're seeing warfare really change is the kind of re-emergence of deterrence. And let me give you some examples of what we've seen of that, especially as it relates to Israel, Hamas, Iran over this period of time. So we've seen deterrence by denial in particular, where the Iranians have done multiple sets of high-end conventional attacks on Israeli territory. And while Israel couldn't stop those attacks, it was able to work with a whole bunch of countries, including the United States, regional militaries, European militaries, to deny Iran what it was trying to do, right? To really repulse hundreds of missiles and drones, which is pretty notable. You've also seen in this kind of return of deterrence as warfare has changed, you've seen real efforts to be able to signal to adversaries when they shouldn't take certain actions. So the best examples here are the signaling efforts to contain much of the conflict at key moments. So after October 7th, after the conventional attacks by the Iranians on Israel, after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh over the summer, a number of moments where countries have worked together to message actors like the Iranians directly or indirectly through other countries to say, stop doing that, while also using military platforms, military capabilities like US aircraft carriers to be able to also convey the seriousness of those messages. So that's a couple ways in which we're seeing the character of war change and the implications for Middle East security. What I'd like to do over the next moment or so is just talk about the region right now as we see it. Look, this is a turbulent region, as we all know. Turbulence means there's opportunities and challenges. And I would really urge you to hold both of those concepts simultaneously. I think it can be argued that 2024 was the most transformative year in the Middle East since 1979. And if we use that as our example, there's some stuff that we see that was pretty extraordinary in the region from that period of time, and some stuff that's really brought a lot of trouble for decades and decades. So, you know, in terms of some of these changes, obviously, one of the big conversations we were initially slated to have focused on Syria here, right? Syria, where a conflict that over almost a decade and a half had become frozen. It had melted over the last 2 months, and we're now looking at a Syria run by a transitional government where for the first time in many decades, folks are starting to think about what does it look like to no longer have authoritarian dictators running around. When we look at Lebanon, another spot along Israel's border, we see a lot of interesting things as well. So we see profound challenges posed for Hezbollah. Probably the biggest challenges, I think, any terrorist group has seen in such a short period of time in history. I'm not aware of another case study where we might see that, where you've really seen kind of the utter degradation of the entire senior leadership, meaningful efforts to degrade and destroy their operational capabilities and a number of their operators as well. A lot of this will come down to the political piece too. And you all probably saw that just in the last few days or so, Lebanon finally got a government for the first time in a couple of years. And it's a pretty decently capable government. And it's not a government that is necessarily beholden to Hezbollah. Now, Lebanon has an extremely complicated political situation, a system of consociationalism. And because of that, it's got to find a way over this period of time to make sure that the state, the government, can represent all the different groups in the country, and that the Lebanese military is really able to ensure security for all the folks across Lebanon. That's a tough effort. They've struggled with it in the past. We'll see kind of how that comes together. And while I could no doubt walk through a number of other parts around the region, maybe I'll just wrap by highlighting, what the implications are here in particular for the United States. Look, I was in Israel with Secretary of Defense Austin just days after October 7th. He went there to show the seriousness with which the United States judged this situation, the imperative to really support Israel in its effort to self-defense, the urgency to try to contain the conflict. In fact, during that trip is when he made the decision to send not one, but 2 U.S. aircraft carriers to try to secure the region and to contain the conflict. And I think it's safe to say, when we were out there just days after the horrific attacks of October 7th, that the region was going to be transformed. I don't know that anyone could have guessed it would be transformed in the ways that we are seeing now. And so for the United States, of course, what it looks like is things like trying to really figure out, assuming the ceasefire is sustainable, what a Gaza day after looks like. What does it look like to actually push continued normalization between Israel and its partners? What does it mean to be able to deal with some of these really fragile and uncertain countries, whether it's through the couple thousand or so U.S. troops based in Syria, or the U.S. effort to help monitor the ceasefire in Lebanon? And then, perhaps just as relevant, what does it look like when Iran is under tremendous pressure from a number of different areas? So I hope the takeaway here is really, we're seeing profound changes in the character of war. We're seeing the regional map also undergo a lot of turbulence, and all of this will really present some opportunities and challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Karlin. Really fascinating opening remarks, and I want to come back to a number of things that you said. I think I want to first begin the Q&A session with Amos. Question over to you on the ceasefire deal and hostage release. We know that the Biden administration has been saying over the past really 15 months that the real obstacle to getting a deal was Hamas, and we know that Israelis want the hostages released, of course, but we do know there's some disagreement about the deal within Israel. Can you shed some light on that for us?
Okay, so first of all, there have been in the last half an hour slight changes in the timeline. I mentioned Sunday as the possibility for the first hostages to be released, only 3 female hostages. Right now, the latest news is that it will probably be Monday. And that could be, at least from an Israeli perspective, it may somewhat overshadow what will happen in DC at the same time. I don't think that it will affect the DC timeline, and yet there's a slight change there. Now, look, according to all public opinion polls for quite some time, a huge majority of Israelis are not only want the hostages back, but are willing to do this by any means necessary, including grave concessions to the Palestinians, including more or less the end of the war in Gaza, including evacuating Israeli forces from there, and including something that was deeply debated in the past, so many of those murderers to be released. And if we go back to the Shalit deal that you probably remember well from 2011, at that time there was huge support again for the deal, and yet we somehow underestimated the effects. Not only the fact that terrorists were out free and roaming later on in the West Bank, but also that a person like Yahya Sinwar was released from prison got back to Gaza, and finally led Hamas to this terrible massacre in 2023. So there are naturally fears over this. The main criticism right now is from the fringes of the Netanyahu coalition. I've mentioned Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who both are against the deal and claim that this would lead to more bloodshed, and that in the future we will see that this was a grave mistake. And yet, I think most of the public, it's not only an emotional issue. I wouldn't simplify the debate. I think most Israelis deeply understand that on October 7th, the country had neglected its own people. The people living in the Gaza envelope and or partying at the Nova party, and even the soldiers at the outpost who were outnumbered by the Hamas attack. All those people were neglected by the state and its organs, by the military, by Shin Bet, and so on. And I think the general line of thinking among most Israelis, it's not only emotional, it's a moral issue, that we need to bring them back, that we failed them, we weren't there on time to save them, as mothers were texting with bleeding fingers from their shelters inside those kibbutzim, and that the people who survived this terrible ordeal need to be saved at all costs. And this is the general sense in Israel right now. Netanyahu, as I've mentioned, has debated that mostly with himself for a long time, but I think he now has no other choice. Part of it is domestic, the huge support among the public, and the other side is, of course, Trump. All of those pressures applied by President Biden apparently were not enough to push Netanyahu over the line. It was Trump's dealings in recent months and what happened behind the scenes that actually forced Netanyahu into agreeing to the deal.
Thank you, Amos. Doctor, I want to return to the Netanyahu government in just a moment, but Dr. Karlin, you talked in your introductory remarks about how Iran's been weakened, right? Particularly over the last 15 months, Israel is certainly helped degrade Hamas and Hezbollah, their proxies. What do you see as the next step there as a new U.S. administration comes in the next couple of days?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you know well, there are kind of two issues that one juggles when you think about Iran and security. One bucket is their support to groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, etc. And one bucket is the nuclear file. So exactly as you noted, Rachel, some of their most capable friends are not looking so hot these days. The Houthis are an exception here. And I think, frankly, they have been the sleeper of this last year and a half of conflicts, where folks didn't really appreciate their willingness to do what they wanted, let alone their capabilities. So I think in this area, what's going to be important is looking hard at what it means for these groups to not rebuild, what it means to make sure that groups like Hezbollah, groups like Hamas are not the guarantors of security for, say, Gaza and Lebanon, respectively. On the other piece, on the nuclear file, this isn't as good of a situation whatsoever. I mean, Iran has made a lot of progress on the nuclear front. Unfortunately, they've made that progress really since the last Trump administration pulled out of the JCPOA. And I think what we will see over kind of this next year or so, next 2 years, is going to be this real debate. Has Iran made the decision that it is going to go as fast as possible and actually leap over the line and try to get nuclear weapons? Or have they decided it's more in their interest right now to keep walking closer and closer to that line? Will the new administration be willing to engage in some diplomatic talks with the Iranians? And if so, what is the criteria that the Trump administration is looking for? I think it would be hard to imagine the Iranians saying something like 100%, we're never going to do this. Obviously, that would be preferable. It's just hard to imagine them agreeing to it. So what kind of criteria will the Trump administration be comfortable with? Will the Israelis be comfortable, and then other countries as well?
Thank you. Dr. Karlin, another question for you about Syria. Attendee writes, there's much distrust in the new rebel government of Syria. It's unclear what their goals are. The Druze and other minorities in Israel are scared. What do you think? We know that the IDF has taken a buffer zone. How long do you see the IDF remaining there? And what do you think of this new de facto Syrian government and how they'll be viewed by the U.S.?
This has obviously been a huge shock, right? I mean, when we go back to when this conflict first erupted, it was a civil war, right? It was domestic, it was inside Syria. You all will recall, of course, these uprisings, these Arab revolutions that were kind of running across a number of countries. I think initially some folks back then were filled with optimism, and as it went years and years, and we just saw the true brutality of the Assad regime, we saw folks like the Russians and Hezbollah and Iran decide to come help the Assad regime. How notable that none of them were able to this round, which I think is pretty meaningful. And now we are handed a very different Syria. So look, it's a little bit of a mystery, not a secret, how this is going to come together. But there's a couple things that I would say one should look for. So one, looking at so HTS is kind of one of the main groups. It's the one that really led this revolution that we saw just after our Thanksgiving holiday. So what does it look like for them to be responsible for governance and for security? The record so far isn't bad. They seem to want to be more inclusive. They seem to want to be more representative. They're talking about different aspects of democracy. Obviously, we're going to all have to look really hard at a say-do gap. I would recall also, though, you have a situation where security has been provided by authoritarians for a couple decades. And we know, looking at Iraq as an example, that when you take the authoritarian out, you are actually buying some time of real bumpiness, if you will. Economically, we know Syria is just really in terrible shape, right? So that's its own problem. The humanitarian piece as well. And then, frankly, reconciliation, right? You've had not just the Assad regime's long, brutal efforts to govern Syria, but then you've also had the civil war and the involvement of a number of actors. So here's what I would say. I think the U.S. administration made the right call by saying we're going to kind of pull off sanctions for a couple months so folks can start doing humanitarian assistance and starting to work with the Syrian people, start working with this government. I think we should keep our eyes wide open. Sometimes revolutions turn out the way one wants. Sometimes, like we saw with the Iranian revolution, they turn out quite differently. Another thing that I would suggest looking for is oftentimes in a revolution, a bunch of different actors get together and say, we know what we don't want, right? The Iranian revolution, you have a bunch of different actors saying, we don't want the Shah, but they totally disagreed on what they did want. Do we see that replicated in Syria as well, where a bunch of folks have said, we don't want Assad, what do we want? And then finally, of course, on this piece regarding the IDF, as Assad was falling, we saw both the US military and the IDF take a whole bunch of steps militarily to deal with ISIS capabilities and then to deal with the Syrian military capabilities respectively. I expect both of those countries are going to be paying a lot of attention along those lines. I expect the areas of Syria that the IDF has occupied over these last few weeks, they're probably going to stay there for a little bit. If you know the geography, of course, and you know what that looks like in terms of the high ground, that's probably a pretty smart move as we're swimming in all of this uncertainty.
Yes, for sure. Thanks, Dr. Karlin. Amos, I am seeing social media posts and we're getting some chats that Ben-Gvir has said moments ago he may resign immediately. Are you seeing that? And what does that mean for the Netanyahu government?
There have been reports in the last few minutes. He held a press conference, as I mentioned. He's now saying that he will resign if the deal passes, if there's a vote in favor of the deal, and that's supposed to be tomorrow at the Security Cabinet in Jerusalem. We'll have to see how much this is worth, and we've seen Ben-Gvir in the past saying all kinds of contradicting things. I assume that he's now under pressure from a lot of his voters and supporters to actually leave, because there's growing resentment among the far right and the settlers and so on to the deal. A lot of people are claiming that this is irresponsible and that this would lead to more bloodshed. He may be having all kinds of political calculations. He wants to be the first minister out to actually acknowledge that he's to have Netanyahu acknowledge that these are the right-wing principles and so on. I don't think that this would prevent a deal. Even if Smotrich resigns right now, I don't think that Bibi has a possible U-turn here. If you remember it, during Ariel Sharon's time, he used to talk about the corrales, which is a Spanish term, meaning pushing you forward into a sort of a narrow corridor when you can't turn. This is the place where Netanyahu is right now. I think that Trump has pushed Netanyahu into the corrales, and I don't think that Netanyahu, never say never with Netanyahu, but I don't think that Netanyahu has a way out of the deal right now, in spite of those reservations made by Ben-Gvir. And even if Ben-Gvir pulls out, Smotrich may yet choose to stay for a little bit at last. And we have to remember, for those two politicians who are on the margins of the Israeli political map for so long, they're having the time of their lives. It's not a surprise that Smotrich, for instance, has been quoted that these are miraculous times, that this is a godly miracle that happened to Israel in spite of the massacre. Of course, Ben-Gvir is a very important member of the Netanyahu coalition. He's managed to change, in my view, to corrupt the police almost completely within 2 years. And Smotrich has also been, in his view, he's been a terrible finance minister, but he's been very effective pushing his own interest groups forward. This has happened regarding the settlements, and this has happened regarding all kinds of interests that the Smotrich and company are invested in. And for both of them, this would be a big step. They may not have a choice, but I'm not sure that they're happy about the consequences here. So, but yet, again, I may be totally wrong on this. I'm not a political analyst, and so many assessments have been mistaken in the past. And yet my current feeling or view is that the deal would move forward, and that the government, Netanyahu government, may not survive the whole affair, and this could probably lead to new elections during this year.
Well, so I wanted to know if you had any observations about what Dr. Karlin said about Syria, what the dynamics are there. Of course, as we mentioned, Dr. Karlin said she would expect IDF to remain in that buffer zone for some time. Well, what are you thinking? We know that the de facto new government of Syria said, told the IDF to retreat.
So I absolutely agree with Dr. Karlin that the Israeli interest right now would be to stay there, at least for the winter. This is hard for Israeli soldiers as well. This is what we call the Syrian top of Mount Hermon. The army is not used to such conditions. And yet the general feeling among the IDF's top brass is that, considering the current dangers and the quick developments in Syria, Israel should take no risks, and therefore it should remain active on the Syrian side of the Golan border and also around Mount Hermon. Now, if we go back and look at the strategic value of those events, and Dr. Karlin, of course, has mentioned that in our introduction, the Iranian axis has suffered huge blows in recent months. Not only what happened to Hamas in Gaza, but also this quite massive victory for Israel in its fight against Hezbollah. And then the attacks in Iran, which were quite effective. The attack in October, which took out most of Iran's strategic anti-aircraft capabilities. And the final blow was the collapse of the Assad regime within 11 days. This was not Netanyahu's work, although he's claiming responsibility in a way in the interviews with the Wall Street Journal and so on. And yet Israel has contributed to that. We know from Turkish intelligence, which was deeply involved with Tahrir al-Sham, that the rebels in Syria waited for the ceasefire in Lebanon because they wanted to be sure that if Hezbollah is willing to accept such a humiliating agreement, this would mean that Hezbollah is not in a place where it can actually easily deploy soldiers or fighters to help the Assad regime. And only when they saw the ceasefire implemented in Lebanon did they start their fight against the Assad regime, and then it took, of course, everybody by surprise. But if we look at the bigger picture, unlike the situation in the south, there's no similar trauma in the north. We haven't encountered a surprise attack by Hezbollah. And if we look at our relationship with the Axis, with Iran and its partners, whether they are the Houthis or Hezbollah or the Syrian regime and so on, Israel more or less has the upper hand right now. It doesn't mean total victory against them, but a lot of this, if you had asked most of the Israeli analysts, including those in uniform, 6 months ago, what are your expectations? Nobody would have dreamt of such a scenario. This has been very, very positive from an Israeli point of view. The danger, of course, is that the Tehran regime, under these circumstances and under so much pressure, may miscalculate and decide to make the final steps towards producing a nuclear bomb. But this is a possible scenario. And yet I think the more likely scenario is more pressure from the Trump administration and an attempt to reach a new nuclear deal that, of course, the president-elect would present as something much bigger and much more positive than the JCPOA, which the Obama administration reached in 2015.
Thanks, Amos. Dr. Karlin, how do you think the U.S. and Israel can take advantage of some of these new Middle East dynamics?
I think some of what they can do is actually building to their competitive advantages. So, for example, the U.S. has had a long relationship with Lebanon, in particular with trying to strengthen the Lebanese military, an effort that I started back after the '06 war. That effort has gone through some ups and downs, but most importantly, what we have seen is that the Lebanese military has consistently acted appropriately over the last really 2 decades or so since that war. There have been many times they have not taken actions that one would want them to, but they've acted appropriately. So now there's a lot of kind of encouragement on them to really fill that security space that Hezbollah had been doing. And the new president of Lebanon just stepped down from being the head of the Lebanese military. So I think U.S. assistance to the Lebanese military is going to be really, really important. In fact, over the last few years, as Lebanon's economy was truly just melting, it was U.S. assistance to the maintain the salaries of the Lebanese military that I think in many ways kept it afloat. So I think that's really one key piece that will be very important. I think just taking, again, kind of Lebanon as one case study here, I think there is now a monitoring mechanism for ceasefire violations that the U.S. is a part of as it relates to Lebanon. And I would urge Israel to try to work through that mechanism rather than taking unilateral actions. I think the fact that the U.S. has said, we're willing to play a role here, that's very different than the 2006 war, where the U.S. obviously was not a part of the UN force and didn't want to touch monitoring because monitoring obviously is a little bit sporty. So I would urge Israel to try to kind of work through that process. And then another key way where I think the two countries can actually cooperate much more so is really looking at what have been the military systems and platforms that have worked well in the different kind of permutations of this conflict, whether in staving off attacks by Iran and by the Houthis or more kind of precision-guided efforts? What's worked well in terms of equipment, training, tactics, and procedures? I think that'll be really important. And then the last piece in particular is really how can the two countries cooperate, including a number of other countries, on in kind of rebuilding Gaza. So getting a lot of humanitarian aid there, setting up some real security and governance mechanisms. We haven't had that in Gaza in decades, right? We had a Palestinian Authority that didn't work so hot. We had Hamas that had its own problems, obviously. So what does it look like to establish meaningful security and governance in Gaza while taking care of the needs of the people? That requires U.S. leadership, requires a lot of cooperation from Israel, and I think will require, frankly, the resources of a number of countries around the region.
Thank you for addressing that. I know it's a really fragile ceasefire right now between Israel and Lebanon. Amos, back over to you. What needs to sort of happen for displaced Israelis to return to their homes, both in the Gaza envelope and then in the north, closer to the Lebanon border?
So in the Gaza envelope, I think 70 to 75% have already returned, and this had to do with government decisions to stop financing for some of those residents. About 60,000 people were uprooted immediately after the massacre, and gradually during 2024, in most of the bigger towns and communities, people came back. This is not true, of course, for those specific kibbutzim that suffered through the worst ordeal. Places like Be'eri Nir Oz, Kfar Aza, Nachal Oz, which were almost burned to the ground. This will take time. They're rebuilding the neighborhoods now. They've moved to different communities further away from the border, and this could take 2, 3, 4 years. And yet a lot of families would have to decide whether they are coming back. I have friends and relatives in this region. I've talked to some of them, and they are still torn apart regarding this because they want to come home. And on the other hand, this is the scene of the most horrific day or the most horrific experience of their lives. And this is true especially to families with young children. If you spend that day hiding at a bomb shelter, hoping for the IDF to come, and as I mentioned, they didn't come in time, how are you going to feel safe with your children again there if it's a mile away from the border? And Gaza has been, as we know, the northern part of the Gaza Strip has been almost destroyed by the war. And yet people are going to come back. Part of the agreement is that close to 1 million Gaza Strip residents are going to come back to those destroyed towns and communities in the north. They will live in tents and so on, but they're not going to be friendly neighbors to Israel. So a lot of Israelis living who used to live in that area still have conflicting thoughts and emotions about this issue. The north would be slightly easier, as I said, because they didn't go through the same terrible experience. And yet people have seen their homes destroyed. A lot of homes were hit by Hezbollah anti-tank missiles and Hezbollah mortar fire and rockets and so on. It will take time to recover. It's not as bad as it may have seemed during the war itself, but it will take time. And these are weaker communities, if I could make this. It's rather a general statement, but this is true. I think there's less solidarity there. And many of the people who moved to the center of Israel during this time because of the events of the war are now having second thoughts about coming back. If they saw life in the center is much easier, it's more expensive, and yet it's easier, not everybody's going to come back. A lot of this depends on how the government performs. And what we know is that it underperformed for a long time. One major improvement had to do with the South because gradually, after failing completely in the first few weeks, Netanyahu did appoint the right people for the job. And there was a lot of improvement and a lot of money spent there. It will take billions and billions of dollars to recover in the South, but there has been an improvement there. This isn't the case in the North. Things are moving slowly and people are frustrated. So this will take time, and we will still see in a few years' time, people still discussing that and the implications of what has happened. And even people in the North, in spite of this very impressive victory that I've described, they don't feel safe yet because they're saying Hezbollah will return to those villages, Shiite villages on the other side. They will be back, and they still see this as a frightening thought.
Thanks, Amos. We certainly hope and pray that folks can return safely to their homes in the not too distant future. Dr. Karlin, I want to ask you about an essay that you wrote recently. I think it was in Foreign Affairs, and it's called The Return of Total War. And you argue that the U.S. needs to widen its aperture on how we think about conflicts in the Middle East and Europe. And I hope you can maybe just expand on that a bit for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, following the September 11th attacks, the United States and the U.S. military really focused on wars that involved fighting terrorists and fighting insurgents. That made a lot of sense. The U.S. military was at war in places like Iraq and Afghanistan for decades. And there was a period of time where folks said, hey, you need to worry about state competitors. You need to worry about the Russian military. You need to worry about China's military in particular. But those were sort of seen as very separate things. And I think increasingly what we've seen through the way that Russia has waged its horrific war on Ukraine, through the many wars that we've seen kind of swirling together in the Middle East over the last year and a half, and to the major challenges to deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, is that actually we do have to have this wider aperture to how we understand conflict. A desire to have short and sharp conflict seems entirely misplaced. A desire to, frankly, focus on one type of challenge in one type of region can miss that those issues pop out in a number of different ways. So let me just give you one example, of course. So if we look at Russia's horrible war on Ukraine, there have been 50 plus countries led by the United States giving military assistance to Ukraine over the last $2.5 billion. I should note, by the way, that about 85–90% or so of the US aid actually gets spent in the United States. What that demonstrates is that there's a bunch of different actors who are shaping that battlefield, some directly and some indirectly. And so this desire that I think defense planners, war planners have had for so long to really section off types of conflict, who's involved with conflict, and how to understand it really needs to be kind of reconceptualized.
Thank you, Dr. Karlin. Amos, I'm gonna ask you a question from our chat. Joan asks, with all these concessions, is Hamas still strong? Can it be said Hamas won? What do you make of that?
No, I don't think Hamas has won this. If we look back at October 7th, they went for a huge gamble, if you'd like. And the results were devastating for us, and they've rocked Israeli society to the core. And yet it was quite clear on October 7th that the Palestinians would pay a full price for that they were bringing upon their people, the Hamas leadership, the greatest disaster, what Palestinians called in Arabic Nakba, since 1948. And this is exactly how things have evolved. And I think that you have to be really disconnected from reality, like many Hamas supporters evidently are, to celebrate this as a big victory. The suffering on the Palestinian side is huge. We in Israel don't have time for this, or energy, or emotional resources, because we're so focused on our own suffering. And yet what has been brought upon the Gaza Strip is terrible. And I think that many Palestinians would gradually be aware of that. It wouldn't mean that Hamas would become suddenly unpopular. And we haven't destroyed Hamas. We've failed in destroying Hamas or defeating it completely. Israel has the upper hand militarily, but it hasn't defeated Hamas completely. Unfortunately, I think that what we'll gradually see is Hamas recovering its capabilities, regaining civilian control of most parts of the Gaza Strip, and trying to rebuild its military networks. This is not good news for Israel. On the other hand, it will probably take them a lot of time, and I'm not sure that they would gamble again and try to provoke Israel again. And I hope that Israel would be more ready next time than they were. The IDF has really screwed up here. It's not only Netanyahu's failure; it's a huge failure, a fiasco, with horrific results for both the IDF and Shin Bet that had led to this terrible massacre. So Hamas has not won that, but it has remained. And for them, the whole idea, they call it sumud, maintaining the struggle, sticking to your guns and not retreating. And in their view, in spite of the fact that most of their leadership, both political and military, is now dead, they've survived. And for them, this is the narrative they're trying to broadcast right now. It's a complicated situation. Nobody has really won this. I think it was impossible to Israel to win this because of what happened on October 7th, and yet it's quite clear who's stronger military from the military perspective right now. We'll have to see how this evolves. So one tragedy, in my view, I think a grave mistake made by Netanyahu is his refusal to discuss the day after. For more than a year, not only the US and not only the international community, but also the IDF top brass, everybody on the security apparatus in Israel has been telling the prime minister, look, you need to discuss the day after. There needs to be some kind of an alternative to Hamas, which would include the PA in any shape or form, in order for us to think of a solution. Netanyahu has refused to do that mostly for domestic political reasons. I think it's part of the failure. And in the end, when finally the Israeli voters get to decide on this, I think a lot of them would remember that he refused to deal with these issues.
Thank you, Amos. Dr. Karlin, I didn't know if you wanted to have a final word with anything that Amos just said, or...
Sure. I wholeheartedly agree with a lot of the points Amos just made. I mean, there are no winners here, right? There are just a whole lot of losers, and it's a question of how, when, and in what ways. As is often the case in the Middle East, the options kind of range between terrible, awful, and catastrophic. I guess I would just highlight that there's a number of battlefields here, and it's probably a little funny for the former defense policymaker to say there's more than the military piece, but there actually is, right? We see that the IDF has been the stronger kind of actor on that front, but on the other battlefields, like on information operations, for example, on the diplomatic battlefield, I'm concerned that these are battlefields in which the Israelis have been put in a particularly difficult position.
Thank you, Dr. Karlin. Amos Harel, grateful for your expertise and insights today, especially with all the breaking news. And we here at DMFI are really cautiously optimistic and will be relieved when we see some of those hostages returning home. I'm very pleased to turn it over to our board co-chair, Todd Richmond, right now for final remarks.
Rachel, thank you so much. Amos Harel and Mara Karlin, I literally could sit here and listen to you all day. I was following the attendance, and we basically had zero drop off. So just so you know, that's quite impressive. Amos, I've been to dinner with you in Israel where I sat and listened, and Dr. Karlin, I'm sure your lectures at Hopkins, people are paying attention. So I just really wanted to say thank you to the both of you. That was incredible, and for our members that are listening here today, you can see how much information is out there. And DMFI is really the only organization that is positioned within the Democratic Party to really disseminate this type of stuff, who has the credibility to do that. But in order for us to do that, we need the resources to make sure that we are on Capitol Hill, to make sure that we are in the capitals of states, and to make sure that we are fighting against disinformation at so many of the conventions, the state conventions, the national conventions that are out there. We are on the ground, but once again, we cannot do it without you. It's the beginning of the year when support is not always as large as it usually is. So we hope that you'll go to dmfi.org, click on support, support the hard work that we do. You got to see Rachel today, our communications director, who's working 24/7 to make sure that we are passing out this information, especially with so many detractors that are on the Hill today. So follow us at Demaj for Israel, dmfi.org. Follow us on Twitter, on Blue Sky, on Instagram, and sign up for our alerts as well. And Dr. Karlin, and Mr. Harel, thank you again. You're amazing. To those people in Southern California, we are thinking of you. And for the hostages that are there, we know that some will still be there. We will not forget about you, and we will fight day in and day out for you. Am Yisrael Chai, and everybody have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.